From St. Catharines, Ontario, Steve Boucher has enjoyed a long and interesting career as a draftsman, a musical performer, and as a writer. Experiences in his youth and childhood were etched into his memory, but they were experiences about which he rarely spoke. Later in his life, he began to speak more openly about them, albeit under the pen name of Jack T. The fact that these experiences have been corroborated by people who shared the encounters at the time makes me listen to them with a more open ear and take them all the more seriously. Today, Steve Boucher speaks more openly about experiences which transformed his life and completely altered his entire worldview. Before we get into today's content, on behalf of the Fifth Kind TV, I want to say a big thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring today's content. Surfshark is a VPN that allows us all to become citizens of the world through online access. If you're like me, you'll enjoy watching online content from countries all around the world. But I live in Australia, and what I'm shown in internet searches will be different to what you're shown in Canada, America, the Philippines, Germany, the Netherlands, or wherever you're watching from. By using Surfshark, I'm able to access a world of online content and see all the things that you see and many other things beside. Surfshark enables us to become citizens of the world through online availability. Get fully protected. Follow the link in the description, sign up and use the promo code FIFTHKIND to receive an 85% discount. Plus, you'll get 3 months for free. Surfshark offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you try it and you don't like it, you can easily cancel your subscription and receive a full refund. With Surfshark, you can swim under the radar in the sea of online content.
We were coming back from somewhere. I was about 4 years old. And back in those days, it would have been around 1959, the cars had sort of a shelf behind the back seat. And the window kind of came down over that shelf. And it was big enough that me being a small child, I could fit on there. And so I used to climb up and lay down on that shelf and look up at the stars. And so as we were driving along, I noticed that there was a bright light up in the sky. And at first I thought it was a star, but I noticed it was moving. And it seemed kind of odd, because it seemed like it was getting closer to me. And I felt like I could hear communication coming from it, like voices. And I found that kind of curious. And it was getting closer and closer to the vehicle, and bigger and bigger. And so I climbed over into the front seat next to my dad, and this thing was, by now, it was at treetop level, and it was pacing us. It was following the car, and my dad hadn't noticed it. And so I pointed out the window and I said, "What's that light out there?" And he said, "What light?" I said, "That light." And he looked out the window, and when he saw it, he seemed really surprised, and he almost like went into an instant panic. And he started pressing on the gas pedal and accelerating and trying to outrun this thing. And there was just no way that you could outrun it. And it was following us. And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "Shut up, leave me alone." And he never talked to me like that usually, but I could see that he was visibly upset about it. And when you're a child of 4, everything is new to you, so I didn't think anything of it. I didn't think that there was anything unusual about it. And so the thing sped ahead. It was like a saucer-shaped craft, and it started coming down in the road in front of us. and we were traveling down a kind of a dirt road, and it shot ahead and it came down in the road. And when it came down, it was bright and it lit up the trees and lit up the road. My dad he couldn't go any further because he'd crash into it if he did. So he slowed down and he stopped the car, and we were about maybe 60 to 80 feet from it. So I noticed he'd regained his composure, and he said to me, he said, "I want you to stay down low and don't look over the dashboard. Just stay down low so they can't see you." And he said, "I'm going to go out and see what they want." And he said, "Under no circumstances do you get out of the car." He said, "You stay in the car, stay down low, and I'll come back." And he said, he insisted that I stay in the car. So he got out, and I kind of peeked over the dashboard, and I noticed there were two beings standing in the road. And I don't know if it was the headlights or the lights behind them, but I could see them clearly. And my dad started walking over to one of them that appeared to be the leader. And he said he started talking to him, and I was peeking over the seat. I was trying to get a better look and wondering if I knew these people, because somehow they seemed kind of familiar. And so my curiosity got the best of me, and you can get away with a lot when you're 4 years old. So I climbed out through the driver's seat, and I started walking toward my dad, and he blocked the view of the being so that he couldn't see me, but the other being could see me plain as day. He couldn't block both of them. And so I was coming up behind my dad slowly, and I saw my dad must have noticed he heard me coming, and so he put his hand behind his back and he was making a motion like that, get back in the car, kind of thing, And but I just kept walking toward him, and the being that was talking to him just kind of suddenly looked over his shoulder like that, and he said, "Oh," he said, "you seem to be concerned about this child." And my dad kind of laughed sheepishly, and he said, "Well, yeah, that's my son." And once he noticed that the being had seen me, he turned to me and he said, "I told you to stay in the car. I told you not to get out. Now go back and get in the car and wait for me, and I'll be there shortly." And so I said, "But I want to see, you know." And so the being talking to my dad, I could hear his voice in my mind. And he said to my dad, "Would you like my friend or a crew member or whatever to take him back to the vehicle for you?" And my dad said, "No, that's okay." He said, "We have to be on our way because my wife's waiting for me at home." And so without waiting for an answer, the being he looked at the other being and kind of nodded his head. And the other being came over to me and took me by the hand and started walking me back to the car. And my dad was just staring at us. And I could see he just wasn't happy about the situation at all. And he was concerned about me, but the being took me, put me back in the car, and he got in next to me in the driver's seat and was sitting there next to me in the car. And at that point, when I looked back at the other being, I noticed that him and my dad were not there anymore. So I had assumed that they went inside the ship. And it was a large saucer-shaped craft. It took up basically the whole road, but it was at night, and it was dark, and there were no other cars on the road. And so I was sitting there with this other being sitting next to me, and he basically kept me company while my dad was being abducted. And so he asked me some questions. He grabbed a hold of the steering wheel and he said, "What does this do?" And I said, "Well, that makes the car go this way or this way, whichever way you turn it." And he said, "Oh, I see." And then he looked down at the floor and he saw the pedals on the floor and he said, "What do those do?" And I said, "Well, one makes the car stop and the other makes it go." And he said, "Oh, okay." And then he pointed to the radio on the dashboard. He said, "What is that?" And I said, "Well, that's a radio." And he said, "What does it do?" And I said, "Well, you can hear music on it and you can hear people talking." And he said, "Oh, you can hear people talking?" And he said, "Can you talk back to them?" And I said, "No, it doesn't work that way. You just hear them. And he said, "Oh, okay." And then he just kept coming up with question after question. And he asked me what I did during the day. Do I go to school? And I said, "No, that's next year." And when I recalled this memory, I realized that I would have been 4 years old because I would have started kindergarten at 5. So, he kept me amused for quite a while. And then I noticed my dad and the other being came out and they were standing there talking in the road. And the being sitting next to me, they were both gray beings with the large heads and the big black eyes. And the eyes kind of curved up around the side of the head. So they had a greater peripheral vision than we normally do. So anyway, he said to me, "I have to go now." And I said, "Well, can't you stay a little longer?" Because I was actually enjoying his company. He was taking an interest in me and talking to me like, not like a little kid, but like an equal. And he said, "Well, maybe I can stay for a minute more." And then I noticed the other being looked at the car and he nodded his head like that. And then he said, "I have to go now." And so he got out of the car and passed my dad in the road coming back to the car. And when my dad got in, he was fairly quiet. He didn't say too much. It's like he was really deep in thought. And so we watched the two beings go onto the ship, and we watched it lift off the road. And they didn't take off really fast. They just kind of moved slowly over the trees, coasting. And my dad started the car, and we continued in the direction we were heading. And then my dad remembered everything up to that point when I asked him what he recalled. And he especially remembered putting his hand behind his back and going like that. And then there was a second part to this encounter where they came back a second time. And they did the same thing. They followed the car and then they came down on the road. And my dad stopped the car and we were watching the craft sitting in the road. And one of the beings got out, the leader, I assume, and started walking back to the car. And when he got to the window of the car, he made a motion like to lower the window. Back in those days, we didn't have electronic windows. They were cranks. You had to crank the window down. And so my dad cranked the window down. And I heard him just before he did that. He said, "Oh, what the hell do they want now?" And so he rolled down the window and he said, "What is it?" And the being said, "You forgot these." And he handed him his glasses. I guess he forgot his glasses on the ship, you know. So my dad thanked him and he walked back to the ship and they left again and we went home. So my dad remembered everything except the part about them coming back the second time.
What's extraordinary about that is that close encounters are a spectrum of experiences. For some, they are very harrowing. For some, they're so harrowing they lay forgotten for decades. Some have interactions that seem more gentle and even suggests a benevolence from the visiting beings. The detail of these visitors coming back and saying to your dad, "You forgot your specs," is really not what people expect to hear when they hear a story of a close encounter. And you even said that as a 4-year-old, you were so unafraid of this being in your car that you wanted him to stay longer and talk longer. So what was your impression of these beings? You weren't scared. Your dad, I'm intrigued, did he have an idea of who he was speaking to? Did you get an impression that maybe he had had contact before that he had remembered or not remembered? Because you describe a picture that seems far calmer than most people would imagine if I say the words close encounter.
Yeah. Well, at that age, I really didn't speculate that much, but it seemed like he knew them and that he was familiar with them. And I believe that he had other encounters before that, you know. And I also had another encounter before that when I was around 2 years old. But
so the encounters that your dad had, was there something about your family or the work that he was involved with that might have meant he would have been interesting to visitors?
Not that I'm aware of. He wasn't anything special like a military guy or anything like that. He was just basically a welder. And then as he got older, he went to school to become a millwright. And so he worked on machinery basically most of his life.
Now, am I right? You were around 30 when you sat down with him and asked him to share his recollections?
I think so. It was the early 80s, probably around 1982.
Did you find he was comfortable talking about it? Was he ready to tell you what had happened?
I think he wasn't expecting it. Like, he probably was aware of it consciously, but had made the decision not to talk about it. You know, because of the nature of it.
Yes.
So,
not wanting to bother you with it.
Yeah. But when I brought the subject up, then he opened up, you know. And I think he was kind of glad that I remembered all this stuff because it kind of confirmed it for him, you know. He was probably wondering about it too, you know.
Had he shared these experiences with anyone else? Did he tell your mom? Did he tell other people?
No. I think I was the only one that talked to him about it.
Tell us a bit about the prior experience you just mentioned when you were even younger.
Well, I was about 2 years old at the time, and I had this little metal cart. There was a lot of the children's toys weren't made of plastic back then. A lot of them were made of metal, like bicycles. And this was like a little cart that had a seat in it and a platform on the front, like a little table. And I could move around in it kind of like a Flintstone mobile, the way the Flintstones used to, move it with their feet. I don't think there were any pedals in it. But I was out in this little cart, and my mother liked it because it kind of confined me, so I couldn't go wandering off. And she could see me through the back door of it was like the lower flat in a house that we were renting. And so I was out there, and I heard this voice calling my name. And I looked around, and it wasn't my mother, and I couldn't see anybody. And they were calling my name, and I said, "Who are you?" And they said, "We're over here behind the bush." And there was like a row of fairly high bushes behind the house. And they said, "Come on over." And so I tried to make my way across the grass, and this little cart wasn't very maneuverable, but I managed to get across the grass and around to the back of the bushes. And this saucer-shaped craft again was sitting on the ground behind the bushes. And you couldn't see it from the house because the bushes were blocking it. And again, there were two beings, and one of them called me by name, and he said, "We were waiting for you." And he came over and he picked me up out of the cart and brought me into the craft. And he laid me on like a gurney kind of arrangement. And the other being laid down on another gurney next to him. And he was kind of in the middle between the two of us. And I remember him fiddling with some gadgets, like electronic gadgets or something. And I think he had me wired with wires on my head. And I was getting nervous, and I said, "I want to go home." And he said, "Not yet." And he said, You're okay. You're not being hurt. You're okay." And he said, "What we're going to do is my friend here is you're going to get a piece of him, and he's going to get a piece of you." And that made me even more upset, because he said, "No, I want to keep all my parts." I was afraid he was going to, take my arm off or something. I didn't know what he was going to do. But what happened was, I believe that he gave me an implant at that time. And after this procedure was finished, he picked me up and took me back to my little cart and put me in it. And he said, "You can go now." And so I started moving back around the side of the bushes toward the house. And I noticed my mother was standing there with her hands on her hips on the cement step, sort of. And when she saw me, she started shaking her finger at me and said, "I told you not to get out of my sight. You stay where I can see you." And she said, "I was worried about you. I was looking all over for you, and I was afraid you'd gone out onto the road." And she said, "If you ever do that again, I'm going to take the fly swatter to you." And I was terrified of the dreaded fly swatter, because when I misbehaved, she used to swat me with this thing, and it stung. And so anyway, she picked me up out of the cart and brought me into the apartment and set me down in the living room. And then she went into the kitchen, and I had these building blocks in the living room on the floor, like wooden building blocks with letters and numbers on them, pre-Sesame Street stuff to teach you the alphabet and things like that. And I was playing with these building blocks. And then I heard that voice again calling me. And I said, "Where are you?" And they said, "Climb up on the couch and look out the window." And so I climbed onto the couch, and there was a window behind the couch that was sort of like a bay window, a small one. And he said, "Look out the window." And I looked out the window, and I said, "Where are you?" And he said, "Look up." And so I looked up into the sky, and I saw this bright light go across the sky. And I got all excited, and I said, "Wow, was that you?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Can you do it again?" And he said, "Yes, I'll do it again." And he said, "I'll tell you when to look." And he said, "Okay, look now." And so I looked up, and I saw the light fly across again. And I said, how can you hear me?" And he said, "Because we can see what you can see, and we can hear what you can hear." So later on, years later, I realized that that was an implant that they must have put in me that allowed them to do that. And it also may have acted as like a telepathic amplifier, so they could speak to me from further away. So anyway, I said, "Am I going to see you?" And they said, "Well, yes, but not today." And I said, "What do you look like?" And they said, "I'll show you." And he said, "Look over between the couch and the chair in the doorway." So I looked over between the couch and the chair, and I noticed that there was like a holographic image starting to appear that looked basically like a gray alien being. And I said, "Is that what you look like?" And he said, "Yes." And then he started to fade away. So I was all excited about this, and I jumped down and I was running into the kitchen to tell my mother about it. And my mother had the vacuum cleaner laying on the floor, and I tripped over um, the tube from the vacuum and hurt my knee. And so I went into the kitchen, and I'd forgotten about the incident after that because my knee was bleeding, and she put a bandage on it and fixed me up. And I never thought anything more of the incident after that.
So did you tell anyone about these two incidents in the years that followed, or as a young child, did you know this was just not something you would want to talk about?
No, I didn't remember these incidents until around the 1980s, the early 80s, because when I wrote to Bud Hopkins, he invited me to come up to Manhattan, and he had an art studio in Manhattan. He was an internationally acclaimed artist, and he invited me up there. He invited my dad too, but my dad couldn't go because he had to work. But me, I had a vacation coming up for a week, and so I decided to go. And my parents both agreed that it would be okay as long as somebody met me off the plane. And he said, "Yeah." He said, "My friend will meet him off the plane and bring him to my studio and give him a key to the studio so he can come and go." And that's exactly what happened. I took this thing that they called the Sky Bus. It wasn't a 747. It was a smaller plane, like a 727 or something like that. And businessmen would use it to commute to other cities, because it was a cheaper airfare than, taking a 747 flight. It was made for businessmen. So that's what I did. And when I got there, I was met by Bud's friend, Ted Boucher. and he had a sign on bristleboard, and he held up that said Bud Hopkins on it. So I knew that he was my contact, and I went over to him. He took me to Bud's studio in a taxi, and gave me a key, and he showed me around, and then he left. You know, so while I was there, he gave me a schedule of, they were going to do 3 hypnosis sessions with Dr. Clamar that does the hypnosis sessions in his book Missing Time. And it turned out she did 2 of them, but she was sick for the 3rd one, so Bud had a key to her office, and she allowed him to do the 3rd session on me. And they recorded these sessions on cassette, and I had the cassettes for quite a while, and I transcribed them, and the transcripts of those cassettes are in my book. So, and then they also sent me to this behavioral therapist, and she gave me some tests, like the Rorschach test that was the ink blots, and she gave me an IQ test, and a test on American history, and they asked me to name American presidents, as many as I could. And I thought it was a little unfair because I'm a Canadian, but I aced it pretty well. I could name a lot of the presidents. I knew more about their history than I did about ours.
It's fascinating. Your story is so interesting because people will often question information retrieved through hypnosis or in deep relaxation, and they'll say, how do you corroborate that information? You were able to do that by talking to your dad, who had experienced one of these encounters with you, and you could compare notes and realized you had the same memory. So there was an external validation of the memory you had retrieved. And that was true also of the account you had in your early 20s with your band. You were able to talk with the people who were with you at the time and realize you were remembering the same event. So I'd love it if you could get us into that story.
Okay. Well, at that time, my band, there were 4 of us, a guitarist, a bass player, a drummer, and I was the lead singer. And I also played these instruments, woodwind instruments. They're called wooden recorders, and they sound like and so I had a shoe bag that I bought a pair of shoes in. I used to keep them in that shoe bag. It was a burlap bag with a drawstring on it. And that night, we had played for about a year as the house band for a hotel in Niagara-on-the-Lake called the American Hotel. And at the end of one of our gigs there, the drummer said a friend of his had invited us to come to a house party in Vineland. It was either Jordan or Vineland. They're both very close together. So I'm going to say Vineland. So he said, are you guys too tired to go? Or because he was hoping we could play one set. And so we agreed that one set would be fine. And, we were still hyped up from playing and everything. We weren't tired. So we drove off to Vineland. And there we got to the house party, went in, and we set up our equipment. And there was a pole lamp in the corner. And it was kind of a spring-loaded telescopic lamp that braced between the floor and the ceiling, and the lights were on the sides of it. So we had to take that pole lamp down so that we could get the drums in and had room for them. So we played a set there, and there was a guy sitting there. There was like a young guy around our age, and he had long hair and a denim jacket and blue jeans, and he looked kind of drunk. And he asked us if we were going to St. Catherine's, and we said yes. And he said, "You mind if I hitch a ride with you?" And I said, "Well, you'd have to talk to the guitarist. He's driving the van." And we said, "We don't have a back seat in it. You'll have to sit on the floor with all the equipment and the amps and drums and stuff." And he said, "That's okay." He said, "I was supposed to meet a friend here, and he was my ride home, and he never showed up. So I was sitting here waiting for him, and they kept giving me drinks." So anyway, we got all the equipment loaded into the van, and we agreed to give this guy a ride home. So he was sitting in there, and said his name was Alex. And so there was the guitarist in the front seat driving. Next to him was the drummer, and then the rest of us were sitting in the back. There was myself, the bass player, Anne Marie, which was the guitarist's girlfriend at the time, and Alex. And we were all sitting on the amps, and so it was kind of crowded. And we're driving home, and we went to get onto the Queen Elizabeth Highway, but it was closed and the gate was down. And so we figured, well, okay, we'll take the North Service Road, and we'll get on at the next junction down the road. And so we started to do that. We were on the North Service Road driving. We were all talking and everything. And Alex was, he was hitting on Anne Marie, trying to pick her up. And the guitarist could hear him, and he wasn't too pleased about this. But anyway, all of a sudden, he stopped the van. And we said, "Why are you stopping?" And he said, "Well, you better take a look at this, because you're not going to believe me." And so we looked over the seat, and there was a restaurant there that I believe now it's called the Lakeside, or the Lake House. At that time, it had a different name. It's had several owners. And in the parking lot, there was this big saucer sitting there in the parking lot on the ground. It had red lights around the outermost perimeter, and it had what looked like recessed portholes above those lights in the upper part of it. And we were a distance away from it at the time, and he said, "What do you think it is?" And it was obviously a flying saucer, but I said, "Well, maybe it's a movie prop." And they said, "Yeah, but why would they be making a movie at 3, 4 in the morning? You know, it seems kind of strange." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, I don't think we should go by it." He says, I think we should turn around, go back, and take the back way home instead." So that's what we decided to do, because, you know, it looked pretty ominous sitting there on the ground, and we were worried about who was in it, you know. So we went to turn around, and I noticed that the van, we couldn't feel the bumps in the road that you normally would feel through the wheels. And so we were floating toward it. And I said, "Well, turn around. I thought you were going to turn around." And he said, "I am." And he had the wheel cranked over as far as it would go. And I said, "Well, put on the brake." And he said, "I'm trying." And he was pumping the brake on the floor, and the vehicle was just moving toward this thing. And so we all kind of panicked, and I was bracing for impact because I didn't know what was happening, if we were going to crash into it or whatever. And so we got up pretty close to it, maybe about 20, 25 feet away, and the van settled on the road and we couldn't start it. And so everybody's yelling all at once and everything, and we were all panicking. And then the drummer turned around and he became like the voice of reason. And he said, "Everybody just shut up." So we all went quiet. And he said, "I don't know what this thing is," but he says, "if we just stay low in the van and stay quiet, not make any noise, then maybe they'll leave us alone." And so him and the guitarist had front row seats for this. They were staring right at the craft. And then I heard the drummer, we all went quiet and we're all waiting on, and I heard the drummer say, "They're getting out." And I said, "Well, what do they look like?" And he said, "They're just little guys." And I said, "Little guys? I wasn't expecting that, And we could hear them moving around outside the van. And I saw the head of one of these grays go by the side window. There was only one big window on the side of the van, and the two windows in the back. No, I don't think even the back doors had windows. But anyway, Alexander, the hitchhiker, was sitting in the back corner, and we were all sitting there kind of panicking. And I grabbed the mic stand because I was afraid that if we got into a scuffle with these guys, I wanted to have some kind of a weapon to protect myself. And Alexander looked around at us and everybody was quiet. And all of a sudden he just reached over and he opened the back door. He grabbed the handle and he opened the back door and pushed it open. And I couldn't believe he did that. None of us could believe it. It was like, why would he do something like that, And when the door flung open, we saw what I feel were three beings in a straight line. And the one in the front was the leader, came in through the back of the van. And I'm not sure if he climbed in or if he floated in or what, but he came in and he was standing inside the van, standing straight up, and his head was clearing the top of the van by about 6 inches. So that'll give you an idea of the height, And it was these same gray beings with the large heads and the eyes that curved up the side of their head. And what I noticed when it was dark inside the van, but we could see well enough to see each other and see this being. And I was trying to move and I couldn't move. I was just paralyzed. And he said, "I'm sorry, but we had to temporarily paralyze you because you were thinking thoughts of violence." And he said, "I was concerned about my safety and the safety of my crew." And he said, "We don't mean you any harm. We just want to run some tests on 2 or 3 of you, and then we'll bring you back and you can be on your way." And so the hitchhiker, he was just sitting there in the back corner, and the being looked at him and he said, "I want you." And then he looked at the bass player and you, and then he looked at me. And when he looked at me, I looked at the floor because I could hear him in my head, but the sound sounded like it was coming from his eyes, not his mouth. And I didn't want to look at his eyes. And so then I got kind of impatient and I looked up at his eyes. And as soon as I looked at him, he said, "And you." And so he selected three of us. I don't know why he didn't pick Anne Marie. He picked the three guys, but and so he said, "Would you follow me, please?" And he turned around and he started to exit the van. And as he got out, uh, as he was getting out, he tripped over the snare drum stand, and the snare drum fell and rolled out the back of the van. And one of the other beings picked it up immediately. And when I got out, and the hitchhiker had got out as well, and the bass player, the three of us were standing there, and the being that had the drum handed it to the leader, and he held onto it, and he looked at me and he said, "Is this yours?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Who does it belong to?" And I said, "It belongs to the drummer," and I pointed to the drummer. And he gave us he gave me a really bad look, like, "Why did you point to me?" And so the leader said to the other being, "Go and get him." And at that point, I noticed that I was face to face with one of these beings. And we were like about a foot away, a foot and a half away from each other. And as I was looking at him, I heard this thought in my head, "Oh my God, are you ever ugly?" And I wasn't sure whether that was me thinking that about him or him thinking that about me. But he turned his head away, like so that I couldn't see his face after I heard that thought. And so then the other being came back with the drummer, and the leader said, "Does this belong to you?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "Is it okay?" And he said, "Yeah, it seems to be okay." And he took it and he laid it on the floor of the van. But I noticed one thing about these beings is they're very careful about anything that you have, your equipment, like drums, glasses, whatever it is. They want to make sure that you leave with what you came with. And so at that point, the drummer became one of us as well. And so he had us all line up along the side of the van. And he said, "We're going on the ship." But he said, "When we go on, we're going to go on as one unit." He said, he said, "I want you to turn to your left and face the back of the person in front of you." And I was behind the drummer. And then he was in front of the drummer. And there was another being, the bass player, and then there was another being behind him. And I assume the hitchhiker as well. So there was a being in the front of this line and one in the back. And we all lifted off the ground. He said, "When we go on the ship," he said, "don't look to the left and don't look to the right." And he said, "And don't touch the hull when we go in." So I was kind of a pretty disobedient kid. And as soon as we started moving and I noticed my feet weren't touching the ground, I looked to the left. And as soon as I did that, we stopped. And so when I faced ahead again, we kept going. And I said, "Oh, that's how it works." And so I turned to the right for a second and we stopped again. And when I faced ahead again, we kept on moving. So we traveled along to the side of the craft, and there was a set of stairs that looked like corrugated metal stairs. And there was an opening in the craft. And I could see lights inside, but they were kind of dim. So I thought we were going to have to get off this thing, whatever it was, and walk up the steps, but we didn't. The whole group of us tilted on an angle, and we went up the stairs together, floated up the stairs. So as we were going up, I couldn't resist the temptation to touch the hull. I wanted to see what it felt like. So I just gently grazed my ring finger of my right hand on the surface of the what seemed like a metal surface, and it felt warm, and it felt like aluminum or some kind of metal. And after that, about 2 weeks later, I ended up with a huge planter's wart on my ring finger where I had touched this craft, and it took weeks to get rid of it. I was putting free zone on it every day, and but I finally got rid of it. But anyway, once we went into the craft, the drummer was in front of me, and he's a pretty tall guy. He was maybe 6 inches taller than me, and he banged his head on the top of the opening going into the craft, and immediately he went, "Ah!" And so the leader in the front turned around and he said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm okay." And once we got in, they separated us from each other, and there was one being for each person. And the being that was with me, I guess, was the leader. And he said, "We want to run some tests on you." He said, "What we need you to do is take off your garments and pile them on the floor in a pile." And he said, "You'll be able to see them from where you are, but we have to have you remove them so we can do these tests." And I noticed that the hitchhiker next to me we were sitting on benches then. And I noticed he'd taken his jeans off and he was wearing long underwear, which I thought was kind of unusual because I hadn't seen many people wear long underwear. They weren't that popular. And so the being that was with me came over to me and he said, I said, "Can I keep my underwear?" And he said, "What is underwear?" And so I pulled the strap to show him what it was. And he said, "Yes, you can keep that." And so I followed him, and he took me over to this part of the ship where there was a countertop. It was curved and followed the curve of the ship. And he sat me on that countertop, and he said, "Wait here." And he went over to talk to this other being, and the other being had like a metal table, and there was a towel on it. And when he rolled out the towel, there were all these instruments on the towel that looked like surgical instruments or dental instruments or something like that, And except for one, there was one that was kind of rectangular, and it looked like the hand piece from a contemporary phone. And so I was watching them, and they were talking, and I thought to myself, I've got to get something. I've got to get something to take from the ship here because nobody's going to believe me. And so I was looking around for something to take, and I couldn't see anything, but my hand came to rest on a knob that was on the drawer below the counter that I was sitting on. And I thought, I wonder if this knob unscrews. So I started turning it, and sure enough, it was getting looser. So I was pulling on it and turning it at the same time, and it came off in my hand. And then I thought, well, where am I going to put this thing? because I didn't have any pockets. So I thought maybe I can stash it under my armpit or something. But he came back over to me and he said, "We're ready to do the test now." And then he said to me, "What have you got?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "You took something." And I realized then that you can't hide anything from these guys. They know your thoughts. And so I opened my hand and I showed him. And when he saw the knob, he took it out of my hand and he said, "You can't keep this." And the other being said, "Why not let him keep it? What harm can it do?" And he said to him, "We're not supposed to let them keep anything." And I thought that was very significant because it kind of suggested to me that they were under some strict protocols that they had to pay attention to. So he took it off me and he put it in a place where I couldn't reach it. And then he brought this gurney like thing over to me and he said, "I want you to slide onto this gurney," or whatever it was. And so um, I slid over onto this thing and I was sitting on it and he wheeled it over to where the other being was with all the instruments. And he picked up the rectangular one that I was kind of wondering about. And he said, "I'll show you how this works." And he held out his arm and he was wearing like it looked like a lab coat or something. And when he shone this thing on his arm, I could see through it and I could see through the skin on his arm. I could see the bones underneath. I could see his skeletal structure. And he said, "Now I'd like to try it on you." And the first thing I said is it going to hurt?" And he said, "No, it's not going to hurt, but it may tingle a little bit." So he said, "I need you to hold out your arm." So I held out my arm and he shone this thing on my arm and it was like a green light. And where he shone it on my arm, I could see not only the bones, but I could see the muscles and the veins and the arteries. And I could actually see my heartbeat pulsing in the veins. And I was really surprised at this thing. I had no idea anything like that ever existed. And he said, "Now we want to take a look in your stomach." So he said, "I need you to lay back on this gurney or whatever it was." I'm choosing the words here, but he may have used a different word. So I laid back on the thing, and there was a light on the ceiling that looked like concentric circles or a helix of some sort, helix. And it was like a white light and it started to spin. And as I was looking at this thing, I found myself getting really tired. And I said, "I don't want to look at that anymore." And he said, "No, I need you to look at it." He said, "Look right into the center of it." So I looked at it again. And as I was looking at it, I just lost consciousness. And so when I came to, I guess they had done some sort of procedure on me because they were looking in my stomach with this device. And I don't know what they did. But he said, "We're finished now." He said, "You can go back to your friends and put your clothes back on." So I had this bag of recorders with me. I took it with me because where I go, I take my instruments with me. I didn't want to leave them in the van. And I had that sitting on top of my clothes. So I picked it up and I put my clothes on. Everybody was getting dressed. And he came over with the other being that had the instruments on the towel, and he was rolling them up. And he said, we have a few minutes now if you want to ask us some questions. And so I started thinking, well, what am I going to ask them? And the one guy asked, where are you guys from? And they said, do you know the stars at all? And we said, not really. And there was like a star map on the wall. And he went over to it and he said, well, it probably won't make any difference to you then if you don't know the stars, but we're from this area here. And personally, I believe he was pointing to Orion, like near the belt of Orion, in the constellation. But anyway, then the next guy asked, do you have any bases around here? And he said, yes, actually, we have one right out here. And he pointed out through the porthole to Lake Ontario, because we were right on the edge of Lake Ontario. And when he came to me, I was thinking all this time, I'm going to ask him something more profound, because he probably gets these kind of questions all the time. So I want to ask him something different. And when he came to me, I said, what is the true religion on earth? And he seemed to be really shocked that I came up with a question like that. And he said, well, why would you ask us a question like that? And I said, well, because you guys are obviously more technologically advanced than we are, and you're probably more socially advanced as well, and more spiritually advanced. So if anybody would know what the true religion is on earth, it would be you guys. And he looked at the other being, and then he looked back at me, and he said, there is no true religion on earth. And he said, that's the end of the questions. And I said, well, wait a minute. I said, you can't just leave me hanging like that. What do you mean there's no true religion on earth? And he said, I'm sorry, but we can't answer any more questions. We've probably said too much already. And so then once we were dressed in that, he made us get up, and we walked over to the doorway of the ship. And then the guys in front of me went down first, and I was going to follow them. And just as it was my turn to go down the steps, he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, wait a minute. He said, I want to talk to you a little more. And at that point, I blacked out again. I don't know what happened, but I lost my consciousness. And when I came to, I was standing on the asphalt where the outside of the ship, and I could see the doorway open. I could see the lights in behind, and he was standing in the doorway, kind of silhouetted in the doorway. And he'd been telling me something telepathically. And I remembered it like it was something that I really wanted to remember. But it's kind of like when you have a really good dream and you're trying to remember as you're waking up, and the dream's drifting away and you just can't remember what was said. The last thing I remember him saying to me was, and you'll be a big help to your friends and your family at that time. And so it was sometime in the future that he was telling me about. And I feel like he gave me some sort of a mission at that time, but I didn't know what it was. But I felt like I'll remember when it's the right time. And so then I was so emotionally involved with what he'd been telling me, and my face was starting to itch. So I went to scratch my face, and it was cold out. It was winter. And I noticed that my face was all wet. And I said, I've been crying for some reason. What would make me cry like that? And then I noticed when I looked back up at him I felt this wave of love that I'd never felt from anybody before in my life. It was like a really powerful wave of love. And it just shocked me. And then he came down and he walked over to me, or floated over to me in the parking lot there. And he said, wasn't there something you wanted to show me? And I was still trying really hard to remember what he had told me. And I said, what? And he said, there was something you wanted to show me. And I realized that it was my recorders that I brought with me on the ship. And I, as a passing thought, I thought if I get a chance to show these things to him, I'd like to do that. And he must have heard that thought. And so I opened up the bag and I took out the recorders and I showed him how they worked. And they came apart in pieces, like there's sections of them. And so I put the tenor one together, which is a little bigger than this one. And I played a little bit for him to show how it worked. And then I handed it to him, and he took it from me and he looked at it and he did something really strange. I thought he was going to put it up to his mouth and play it. But instead of doing that, he put it up to his nostrils and he blew into it and he got a couple of sounds out of it. And I thought, that's really strange. Why did he do that? And it wasn't until years later when Q-Forn investigated my case that I read a report that they had of an alien autopsy of one of these gray beings written by Leonard Stringfield. And in the autopsy, it said that the mouth is basically a pocket. It doesn't go, they don't have a complete digestive system. It stops at the back of the throat. And but they do have an organ that does the job of the lungs and the heart and the liver. And so they're only able to breathe through their nose. So that told me why he put it up to his nose to play it, because they couldn't blow through their mouth. And so I thought that was pretty interesting when Q-Forn showed me that piece of information. But that was basically where the encounter with them ended. And he asked me if he'd like me, if I'd like him to walk me back to my vehicle. And I said, no, that's okay. I'll go back. And I said, am I going to see you again? And he said, oh, yes, you'll see us again. So I said goodbye and I walked back to the van, and the back doors of the van were open. And when I looked inside, all the members of the band were sort of, they looked like mannequins, like they were all in suspended animation. And as soon as I climbed in, they all came back to life. And the drummer said, we've been talking about this. And he said, we came to a decision that none of us are going to tell anybody about this. And he said, we need you to agree to this. And I said, no. I said, people should know about this stuff. I said, I'm not going to agree to that. And he said, well, if you tell anybody, he said, we'll deny it and you'll just look like a fool. So I was really upset. And another thing I noticed is that the hitchhiker wasn't there anymore. He never came back to the van. And I wondered, how is he going to get from here to St. Catharines? Because that's a long walk and it was a cold night. So I found out years later, when I recorded this experience and it was released on YouTube. He saw the video and he contacted me, and he contacted me on Facebook, but his profile was just a blank. There was no picture, there was no friends list, no wall, or there was nothing. It was just a blank profile with his name. And that's how I communicated with him. And he told me that he was involved in some stuff and he didn't want me to be involved. So he didn't accept my friend request, but he communicated with me. And so I always kind of wondered about this guy, what happened to him, where he went. And he told me eventually on Facebook, and I recorded our conversation and I copied and pasted it into a Word document, and it's in my book. So if you want to get the full story, you have to read my book.
That's wonderful. Now, your book is titled Beyond the Extraterrestrial Firewall, an Experiencer's Point of View. So if you want to hear the rest of that story, that's where you need to go for those details. And there's a foreword to that book by Grant Cameron. One little detail of that experience that, well, there's lots that fascinates me about that experience. And there's the cover of the book.
Yeah.
Again, similar to the interaction between your dad and the visitors when you were about 4 years old, there was a gentleness and an understanding of how you would be thinking and feeling. There was an attempt to reassure you as this process was done. We're not going to hurt you. You'll be all right. You'll be able to see your clothes.
Right.
That they understood that you'd be concerned about those things. And that would surprise a lot of hearers, I think. And then there was another detail that you didn't mention, but I've heard you say it before, that one of the guys refused to get undressed when you got into the craft, and he didn't.
No.
They didn't force him.
No, he argued with this being for a while. He was standing by the doorway of the ship, and I could hear them arguing, and he just absolutely refused. And in the end, the being gave up and said, well, we respect your decision. And, you know, so they weren't overly aggressive beings. They were...
yes.
You know,
and not overly aggressive, and also that little detail that they were under orders. They were under instructions. We're not allowed to tell them too much. We're not allowed to give them stuff, so on and so forth. And that's intriguing because it just gives us a hint that there's a bigger picture to this. This is not just an isolated incident. It's part of a bigger pattern. And I wondered in the time since what your reflection is about the bigger picture. Why were they here? What did they want? Why were they running tests on you? And how do you think they are connected to us?
Go to fifthkind.tv for uncensored access to the full interview.